No, the lawsuit was frivolous. Spurious bullshit.
Oh, I beg to differ, Jim effing Sterling's son. I beg to differ. Digital Homicide. For many people, the name just invokes images of overly proud game developers throwing tantrums because people are giving their games bad reviews, being unable to accept criticism, and their failure to take criticism ultimately resulting in the destruction of their own careers after Valve was forced to ban them from Steam. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel the same way for quite some time, mostly because Jim Sterling's was the only side of the story I was ever exposed to. However, you know what happens when you hear a story many times? You start to notice cracks in the story, and when you look at those cracks a little more closely, they start to sound like glaring plot holes. The more you think about those glaring plot holes, the more they interfere with your ability to enjoy what used to be very enjoyable stories. That is how I have come to see Jim Sterling's beef with Digital Homicide. What's up guys, Acerthorn here, and welcome to another video game industry discussion video. I do these types of videos on a regular basis, so if you'd like to see more of them, hit that subscribe button to stay notified. Before I begin the discussion proper, allow me to introduce myself. I consider myself very thorough in my analysis. I do my level best to leave no stone unturned before I publish my theories. So far, I seem to have a pretty good track record of convincing people of my points, at least those who are willing to approach the various topics with a fair and open mind. Here are just a few comments people have left on my videos where they praise my ability to convince them to change their tunes on various topics, just to give you a taste of what this video will hopefully have in store for you. That being said, I absolutely do not expect to convince Jim Sterling himself of my position today in the 1 in a million chance he actually sees this video in the first place. His personal hatred of and vendetta against Digital Homicide and the Remind brothers runs so deep that he is, in all likelihood, completely beyond any and all reason when it comes to this topic. However, I hope to show at least a few of you guys that maybe Sterling was overreacting just a touch, and maybe we ought to give the Remind brothers a second chance. Hell, for those of you who judged the Remind brothers sight unseen based on the stuff you've heard about them, hopefully you can be convinced them to give them a first chance. I also want to fully disclose the extent of my personal knowledge of the Jim Sterling Digital Homicide rivalry. Specifically, I have no personal knowledge whatsoever. As I mentioned in my video, 5 Reasons Why Jim Sterling is a Filthy Hypocrite, I subscribed to Sterling after seeing his video, The Addictive Cost of Predatory Video Game Monetization. This means that I became a Jim Sterling fan years after his feud with Digital Homicide had concluded. I did not follow the Digital Homicide feud while it was ongoing. I only heard about it after the fact. Now, you might think that this means I cannot possibly understand the true scope of the problem, that I can't possibly know what really happened because I wasn't there. However, I respectfully disagree with that argument. I believe my lack of personal involvement in the dispute makes me uniquely qualified to assess what really happened. Think about it this way. You know how, if you are a witness to a crime, if you know the defendant personally, or hell, if you even so much as read about the crime in the paper, you're not supposed to be allowed to serve on the jury in that case? Well, think for a minute about the reason why that law exists, and you can start to realize how I am in a much better position to judge what really happened than, say, Jim Sterling himself. As the old adage goes, nobody should be allowed to be the judge of his own case. In addition, while I am not one anymore, I should point out that I used to do work as a freelance paralegal. Despite not having a law degree, I have extensive experience and therefore extensive understanding in dealing with the court system and in researching the law. This experience and legal knowledge will certainly come in quite handy when I get to the portions of this video which discuss the lawsuits Digital Homicide had filed against Sterling and the anonymous Steam users. Last but not least, I should probably disclose that before making this video, I attempted to reach out to Digital Homicide themselves and try to get their side of the story. This video was originally going to be called Digital Homicide's Side of the Story. However, several weeks went by and Digital Homicide did not respond to my request for interview. Now, there are an infinite number of reasons why they may not have responded, so I will not judge them for that. However, I do feel it is worth pointing out that I am basing today's videos on admittedly incomplete information. Every point I will argue in today's video is based on what observations I was able to cobble together, not what anyone else has told me. Just throwing that out there. Alright, now that all the disclosures are out of the way, let's begin the video proper. I suppose the best place to start is where it all began. That's how beginnings work, right? Well, this all started in late 2014. Jim Sterling was just beginning his career as an independent video game pundit, wrapping up the business he had with Escapist, and getting ready to go full-time on YouTube funded entirely through Patreon, a position he continues to hold to this day. One of the earliest videos he published as an independent pundit and critic was The Slaughtering Grounds, a new worst game of 2014 contender. Digital Homicide saw that video and proceeded to make a response video called Review the Reviewer. His professionalism and candor in this response video is, lacking to say the least. Now this is the point where so many on Team Sterling believe that Digital Homicide committed its first and most grave error in all of this. Their inability to accept criticism effectively laid the foundation for their subsequent downfall over the next couple of years. However, while I admit that Digital Homicide could have handled this response video with a bit more forethought, I'm not going to ignore Sterling's contribution to this problem completely. Sterling's attitude towards the Slaughtering Grounds was harsh, extremely harsh. In fact, it appears, at least from my point of view, that Sterling was going out of his way to be as harsh on the game as he possibly could. Here are just a few clips of the things Sterling said about this game.
You gotta do these challenges. How can I do these challenges when you don't give me any fucking ammunition? I mean, this shit is beyond the pale. Like, there's no artistic theme.
Damn, Jim! Do you think you could rein in the hate just a touch? Bear in mind that this was before Digital Homicide did all the supposedly terrible things that earned them the dubious legacy they currently have. They didn't just start out with this reputation of being these tantrum-throwing man-children. If that reputation is even justified in the first place, see the rest of this video for details. It honestly seems like you were going out of your way to actively provoke Digital Homicide into giving this sort of response. You have to understand that this Review the Reviewer response video is the most unprofessional that Digital Homicide ever acted in the entire time he had any dealings with Jim Sterling, and all he was doing was retorting against the line-crossing attacks that Jim Sterling leveled against them entirely unprovoked. Now, I know what many, if not most, of you are thinking right now. Well, game developers need to learn to accept criticism as a matter of course. Quite frankly, I find that argument to be some hot bullshit. As a YouTube content creator myself, I have been on the receiving end of quite a few of these kinds of toxic, egregious, venomous, line-crossing personal attacks. I have been called scum, I have been called garbage, I have been told to suck dicks. I have had people create throwaway accounts just so they can cuss me out without their main accounts getting banned. So, I honestly know how Digital Homicide feels when he has to listen to people like Sterling make personal attacks against the developers rather than just critiquing the game. Many people seem to see game developers, YouTube channel owners, and many other types of creators, especially independent creators, as essentially free shots. Normal people are free to unleash their own personal hang-ups on the creators, throwing every insult under the sun at them, calling them every vulgar word they can think of, and if the creator retorts in any way, shape, or form, they're the ones who just can't take criticism. And I say, fuck that shit. Do you work with customers as part of your day job? You probably have to deal with a lot of shit from those shithead customers. Even if you don't work with your customers at your day job, you most certainly have to answer to at least one person, namely your boss, who can be a complete dickhead at times. If a customer at your job leveled insults at you even half as egregious as these comments, that customer would be banned from your store's premises and be told never to return in a fucking heartbeat. Face fucking facts. We are all people. We all have feelings, and none of us, fucking none of us, deserve that kind of verbal abuse. And no, being an independent content creator or game developer does not fucking change that. So while Digital Homicide's review the reviewer response video might have been the most unprofessional Digital Homicide behaved in this entire saga, I would like everyone to understand that Jim Sterling threw the first punch. Now, am I saying that two wrongs make a right? Am I saying that Digital Homicide's actions were completely justified and that Jim Sterling deserves 100% of the blame? No, not by a long shot. What I am saying is that this should have been seen as a case of two wrongs not making a right from the outset. Instead, Jim Sterling seems to be entirely vindicated by the court of public opinion, while Digital Homicide takes 100% of the blame. In fact, not only do I believe Jim Sterling was way more unprofessional than he needed to be when reviewing the slaughtering grounds, I actually think he knows full well that he is crossing lines he absolutely does not need to cross in order to make his points when reviewing the games. I absolutely believe he is lying out his ass when he accuses Digital Homicide of being the sole offender between the two. How do I know this, you ask? Well, for starters, let's take a brief clip from his Jimquisition video, A Lesson in 5 Nights, where he says the following.
The effect the criticism had on Scott was anything but amusing. The developer spiraled into a deep depression as a result of the response. I'm a sometimes brutal critic, but I have a sympathy for it. It's hard to have something you worked on criticized, even harder to see it just torn apart.
Notice what he just said. He freely admitted that there is a difference between simply reporting the pros and cons of any given game professionally and dutifully and engaging in line-crossing personal attacks against the game developers. Then, he freely admitted to being in the latter category when it comes to most of the games he reviews. He freely admits to going far above and far beyond what is actually necessary to warn his fans of a game's flaws and enable them to make informed purchasing decisions. Not only that, but he admits to being fully aware of how hurt the subjects of his reviews can feel because of his over-the-line, insult-laden reviews. But okay, let's give Sterling every conceivable benefit of the doubt, and assume that he wasn't personally aware of how over the line he was being with Digital Homicide in particular. It would be incredibly obtuse of him to not realize that when he realizes how vulgar he is being with everyone else, but let's assume the worst case scenario here. Do I have any evidence that Sterling is personally aware that he is being unnecessarily vulgar against specifically Digital Homicide? Yes. Yes, I do. It is said that all magic tricks rely on the magician's ability to distract you from the lie while getting you to focus your attention where he wants you to. And while Jim Sterling is certainly no magician, though he definitely dresses up as one, my experience watching his videos have nevertheless shown him glossing over numerous points while only addressing the arguments he feels he can refute. One such example is in his 2015 Jimquisition video titled The Slaughtering Grounds, a Steam Meltdown Saga, where he says the following.
It seems Imminent Uprising takes phrases absolutely literally, as shown in an email it sent to Popad where it declared that my video wasn't protected under fair use because my criticism was unfair. Yes, these guys believe that fair use means fair use, as in, if you think the critic is being a meanie poophead, you can try and weaponize the legal system against them.
Okay, did you see the lie he's trying to distract you from? He asserts that Digital Homicide merely wants to silence criticism of his games, immediately after acknowledging that Digital Homicide has allowed other critical videos to remain open. He completely neglects to address the fact that Digital Homicide claims that he would be fine with negative reviews of his games if they would just act in a fair and reasonable manner when doing so. Sterling completely ignores that point. So clearly he thinks he has the right to level whatever egregious line-crossing personal insults he wants at a game developer. And the developer is expected to just sit there and take it without retort like he's in a goddamned boot camp. Now, am I saying that Digital Homicide was legally in the right to bring a DMCA takedown notice against Sterling? Did he actually have a legitimate case of copyright infringement against Sterling after all? No, he did not. The reasonableness, professionalism, and civility of the criticism is simply not a relevant factor in a fair use determination as a matter of law. However, my purpose with this video is not to argue the legality of the matter, although I will be addressing the lawsuits Digital Homicide has filed later in this video, though not in a legal sense. Rather, my purpose with this video is to appeal to the court of public opinion, and to that end, I truly believe not just that Sterling was way more unprofessional than he needed to be, but that he knew full well that he was way more unprofessional than he needed to be and simply didn't care. Therefore, his attempts to portray himself as nothing but the victim, while portraying Digital Homicide as nothing but the offender, is the equivalent of a bully in school goading a little kid into swinging at him, beating the shit out of that little kid, and then claiming that beatdown was done in self-defense. Now let me reiterate. Digital Homicide's response video, Review the Reviewer, is the most, literally the most, unprofessional he has acted in this entire debacle. All other instances of his behavior after that point, I believe, are entirely defensible, which transitions me to my next point for this video. In his Jimquisition video, Steam Needs to Axe Shithead Developers, Sterling came down hard on his belief that indie developers on Steam should be held to the same standards of professionalism, ethics, and on-the-job behavior as actual Valve employees, and that Valve should discipline unruly indie developers the same way they would discipline their own developers. In that video, he held Digital Homicide up as a prime example of the kind of lack of professionalism that allegedly plagued Steam at the time that video was made. However, I just don't see it. Now, to be fair, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I was not around when this feud was ongoing, so I have no way of knowing exactly what I would have found if I had checked out Digital Homicide's Steam forum posts. However, Jim Sterling has saved a few screenshots of those posts made by Digital Homicide, which he shares with us from time to time in his own videos. In one of these screenshots, Digital Homicide honestly comes off as quite patient with his customers, thanking them for their input. I'm sorry, but how does that even remotely qualify as unhinged delusional hack behavior? Now I want you to consider the fact that in this same video, he shows us screenshots from a guy called Blind1964. Put those forum posts side by side with Digital Homicide's posts. Which one would you say shows a complete lack of professionalism? Get a life, you filthy queer! Or, the games will remain as they are. Thank you for your input. Now I know what you're thinking. This is only one screenshot. Surely Digital Homicide had other altercations with other customers, where his delusional, unhinged personality truly showed, right? Well, I highly doubt it. Granted, I cannot see any more of Digital Homicide's Steam forum posts due to the simple fact that they were all deleted right alongside Digital Homicide's Steam account. The only reason I can see this one screenshot is because Jim Sterling used that screenshot in some of his videos. So while there is a 1 in a million chance he might have acted truly vile towards his customers in another post, it really is a 1 in a million chance. Think about it. Sterling obviously considers these screenshots to be representative of Digital Homicide's general behavior on Steam. Otherwise, he would not have used them for this purpose. The fact that he used this screenshot as an example necessarily means he considers this example to be exemplary. Nah? So until I see some direct evidence to the contrary, I am going to treat these screenshots as representative of Digital Homicide's behavior. Okay, some of you were thinking right now, but I personally remember having interactions with Digital Homicide as a paying customer, and I can recall him being truly just as unprofessional as he was in his Review the Reviewer videos, despite me doing my level best not to throw the first punch at him. To that I say, can you please tell me exactly what you said to him and exactly what he said in response? And when I say exactly what he said, I mean word for word, verbatim, what he said. That may sound like I'm just sea lioning right now, but I'm really not. In my past experience, I have learned that the slightest difference in semantics can often make all the difference in the world. Think about it. Jim Sterling is obviously so filled with hate and rage against Digital Homicide that this perfectly cordial screenshot was used by him as an example of quote-unquote unhinged delusional behavior. Clearly, Sterling's mind was so clouded by rage and hate that he couldn't see what was literally right in front of him. So unless I know exactly, verbatim, what was said between the two of you, how do I know that your memories of what happened haven't been similarly tainted by rage and hate? So no, To make sure you aren't just overreacting to Digital Homicide's perfectly cordial behavior, I want to know the exact words that were said. And unless you have a preserved screenshot of your own, I highly doubt anyone's memory is good enough to remember the conversation with that level of detail. And if you do still have screenshots after all this time, I think it's more pathetic of you than it is of the Remind brothers. So, now that I've hopefully demonstrated that Digital Homicide's decorum wasn't nearly as appalling as Sterling makes them out to be, why don't we take a look at Jim Sterling's decorum, shall we? Because I find it rather amusing, in the most pathetic way imaginable, that Sterling is asking Valve to enforce professionalism standards among its game developers, while simultaneously feeling like he should not need to follow those professionalism standards himself. Now bear in mind, the compilation of moments I am about to show you do not include any moments where it appears that Sterling was trying to be sarcastic or over the top for the purposes of being entertaining. I am aware that he is a YouTube personality and thus needs to be over the top at times in order to maintain audience attention and engagement. Because of this, I will not be including any moments where it appears that Sterling was simply putting on a show, like that time he said he was just as infallible as the Pope but with a bigger dildo, or when he refers to Andrew Wilson as a robot. No, every moment in this upcoming compilation of clips are from moments when he genuinely appears to be being serious about his coverage. Despite this supposed seriousness, I want you all to pay attention to just how unprofessional he is, and how he lacks the iota of decorum he often criticizes indie developers on Steam for lacking. Are you ready? Okay, here we go.
Shut the fuck up, Electronic Arts. Seriously, for realsies on this one, shut your stinking shit-stained lips. Hey Bethesda, you know mods? Right, and do you know money? You know about money, right? Right, when you exchange money for things, that's called paying for it. You pay for it. And if the thing you exchanged money for was mods, oh, well, you just gone and dang old bought some paid mods right there, didn't ya? And the statement is, they will tongue arsehole. They will tongue dictatorial arsehole to make more money. And with their tongues so firmly up Xi Jinping's arsehole, they're in a prime position to do what I think they should be doing. Eating poo! It fucking baffles me that this guy actually has veteran career status because he talks like an overprivileged Tory politician who's never had to work a day in his life. It reeks of a fuck you got mine attitude. He's made it so everybody can make it, and if you can't, then you're just not trying hard enough. And I was encouraged to keep playing, not paying, playing. There's an L in there, you fucking tit. There's an L in there. It's a choice, not a force. Horse fucking dick. Horse dick, it's a choice. But the point is, basically all entertainment rated suitable for children doesn't need its content age gated because they're rated as suitable for the fucking age of the fucking children. Nintendo is officially overseen by a collective of dribbling fucking idiots who are so stupid they panic every time they shit themselves because they think they're melting. But it's okay, you libertine swine! The game had a 90-day roadmap of shit that should have been in the game when the goddamn money changed hands. He is so steamed about this issue and so thoroughly well informed that he suggested games ought to be subject to a rating system. That's a great idea, El Presidente. Maybe if we had something like that, like a ratings board for software with the purpose of entertainment. Some sort of entertainment software rating board, perhaps. We could call it the ESRB for short. I say this in response. Fuck you. Fuck you, you predatory, exploitative, callous, audacious fucking scavengers. You duplicitous shovelers of digital filth. You can fuck right the fuck off with the insincere saline that dribbles from your decaying mouths whenever you try and validate the harmful business practices and your decision to steadily erode the value of your games while asking for ever more money. One of them, two of them for the ESA. In general. But 4 now, here's another 2, just for that. A few episodes ago, the Jimquisition helped contribute to the exposure of Brash Games, a company that seems to die a deserved death temporarily before coming back in a major way. Don't call it a comeback though, unless you really emphasise the word cum and mean semen when you say it, because that's what Brash Games is right now, a cold puddle of cum in the eyes of the industry. If you want to know if there'll be a collector's edition, of course there will be. This is a AAA game now, you naive little fuck. Eat shit! It's not going to make you look good. It's not going to make your game better received. All it's going to do is amplify the criticism and metaphorically tattoo your metaphorical forehead with the non-metaphorical words fucking dumbass. I'm sick to death of the sheer volume of bloody sponsorship proposals from marketing companies that are either fucking ignorant or fucking inconsiderate, and who shovel their spam into my inbox like a drunken groom attempting to mash his flimsy, vodka-softened penis into the disappointed orifice of his bored, unsatisfied bride. You can love a character since 2005 like Tira, get to know their moves, get to learn the evolution of them from game to game, and then suddenly, boop, fuck you, give us more money. More money on top of the premium price you already paid to get the game. Fuck you, give us more money. The best I'd expect from Google anymore is another shitty robot that can't tell the difference between a penis and a car, let alone navigate the tricky minefield of free expression versus harmful material.
Wow. Just wow. For someone who criticizes indie Steam developers for lacking any professionalism or decorum, you sure seem to be willing to throw cuss-filled insults at game developers on a whim and lose your shit a lot. Maybe you should move out of your glass house before you throw stones at others. I'm pretty sure there's a word for guys like you. I think it begins with the letter H. I think it's 3 syllables long, but I just can't put my finger on it right now. Oh well, life goes on. So now that I've torn to shreds the accusations that Digital Homicide are temper tantrum throwing man-children who simply can't take criticism, while showing you that Sterling himself is just as bad as he accuses Digital Homicide of being, let's talk about the next most popular insult people often like to throw at Digital Homicide. The fact that they are not only asset flippers, but archetypal asset flippers. First, I'd like to point out this little gem from Sterling. When Sterling made his video, Digital Homicide resurfaces with some incredible BS. He publicly responds to a number of things they state in their blog posts. At one point in his video, he says the following.
Contrary to massive amounts of articles and videos on the topic, I never took a complete project and published it under Digital Homicide like it was my game. Look mate, I invented the term asset flip. I know what it means, you asset flipper, shut the fuck up.
Okay Jim, let me get this straight. Because you coined the term, that means that you have ultimate authority to determine who is and isn't an asset flipper, regardless of the evidence, regardless of the facts, and to the exclusion of all other factors. No matter how little someone might fit the definitions that you have laid out for what an asset flip is, if you, in your sole, unfettered discretion, decide someone is an asset flipper, then it doesn't matter what the objective facts are. Is that it? Because that's basically what you sounded like when you said that. Also, once again, the magician is distracting you from the lie while getting you to focus your attention where he wants you to. Digital Homicide outright states that they used these store-bought assets as a basis to create something original, something Sterling had said in the past was an acceptable use of assets. However, he completely ignores that sentence here, instead preferring to invoke his absolute authority to decide who is and isn't an asset flipper to the exclusion of all other factors. So what is an asset flip anyway? Well, according to Sterling himself in both his Jimquisition video, Asset Flip, as well as his Jimquisition video, Talent is an Asset, a genuinely unscrupulous asset flip differs from a good game that simply uses assets in that the former uses them in a way that isn't original. Okay, so how does that make Digital Homicide an asset flip company? The problem with this definition is that it is entirely subject to the discretion of whoever is using the term. He points to PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds as an example of a game that uses assets without being an asset flip, complaining that there is just too much originality in that game for it to be an asset flip. PUBG looks like PUBG. Violet looks and feels like Violet. However, aside from the occasional example, Sterling fails to provide any real objective guidance on how to use assets in an ethical way. He just says that the use of assets is acceptable if the game is good overall. If the game is good, it's not an asset flip. If the game is trash and it uses pre-bought assets, it is an asset flip. The problem with that position, however, is that it ceases to be an issue of ethical business practices like plagiarism, and instead becomes purely an issue of artistic tastes. It becomes entirely subjective at that point. Here, try thinking about it this way. Imagine if you were playing the Slaughtering Grounds, except that it didn't use store-bought assets. Forget for a minute that this zombie guy is something that you can buy at the Unity Asset Store. Imagine if that was a character model that Digital Homicide created itself. Their own original USPS postbox graphics placed alongside their own original UK phone booth graphics. The music was still a 30-second looping track, but it was music composed by Digital Homicide rather than a royalty-free Kevin MacLeod soundtrack. However, everything else about this hypothetical Slaughtering Grounds is identical in every way to the version of the game that exists in real life. All the bugs, the scarcity of ammunition, the fact that the game consistently crashes after 3 levels. Even the graphics themselves are identical to the real thing, except for the fact that the graphics really were created by the developers instead of store-bought. Would that version of the Slaughtering Grounds suddenly become a good, or even acceptable, game? Probably not. The game would still be shit. Hey, this video was called In Defense of Digital Homicide, not In Defense of the Slaughtering Grounds. Hell, even Robert Romine himself admitted that the Slaughtering Grounds were low quality. Here, have a listen.
I'm sorry, we have 5 video games, but as you've stated, they're low-quality video games. I'm not saying any of our games are amazing.
So no, the game would still be shit. It would just be shit that used original artwork rather than store-bought assets. Well, when you look at it that way, you start to realize that the use of store-bought assets is completely and utterly irrelevant to the discussion of whether a game and or its developers deserve to be shat on. Your criticism at that point becomes no different than your criticism of this game, or this game, or this game. A game that uses original artwork and is shit, and a game that uses store-bought assets and is shit, will both receive the same amount of criticism and panning. Meanwhile, a game that uses original artwork and is good, and a game that uses store-bought assets and is good, will likewise be given equal amounts of praise. The use of store-bought versus original assets has no bearing on whether you like or don't like a game, so why even bring it up at all? Actually, I think I know why guys like Sterling like to bring it up. See, there are people, a lot of people, who like to see their opinions as objective fact. They don't like to have to simply agree to disagree with people. If someone disagrees with them, they will often try to justify their opinions as being objectively correct, while their opponent's opinions are objectively wrong. The test for whether a game constitutes an asset flip or not is an entirely subjective one, and it is the same test that is applied to every other game in existence. However, by instead drawing attention to the developer's business model or behind-the-scenes development strategies, you can take the focus off whether you just like the game personally and instead create the illusion that your criticism is grounded in objective fact, because heaven forbid you own up to the subjectivity of your own criticism and invite people to agree to disagree with you. So no, Digital Homicide is not an asset flipper, both because they use store-bought assets as a starting position and build something original off them, something the self-proclaimed inventor of the term said was an acceptable practice, but also because the very term asset flip is a completely meaningless term. It literally tells us nothing at all about the game. It simply exists to confuse the issues and divert attention away from what should be the focus of the criticism in a shameless attempt to create the illusion that your criticism is grounded in objective fact. In his video, when Jim Sterling was sued for $10 million by Digital Homicide, Sterling claims that Digital Homicide wanted him to never mention them again, and to instead, and I quote, just let them go about peddling their shite. Meanwhile, on their blog post, Digital Homicide says that all they wanted was for Sterling to cover them the way he would cover any other developer, instead of constantly singling them out and covering them to the exclusion of everyone else. Who is right in this regard? Well, let's look at the objective facts. As Jim Sterling himself pointed out in his video, Steam needs to stop selling toys full of cum, more than 7,000 games were uploaded to Steam in the years 2015 and 2016. 7,000 games. This surge of game uploads often receives quite a lot of valid criticism, in that it makes legitimately good games harder to notice because they tend to get lost in the shuffle. However, by that same logic, shouldn't it also make shitty games harder to find because they, likewise, get lost in the shuffle as well? Whenever Digital Homicide made and released a game, Jim Sterling was almost certainly guaranteed to cover it. It was practically expected that Sterling would do a Squirty Plays video about the newest Digital Homicide game. Of those 7,000 games that were uploaded to Steam, Digital Homicide made 9 of them. Less than 0.13% of Steam's games in 2015 and 2016 were Digital Homicide games. If you picked a Steam game released in 2015 or 2016 at complete random, you had less than a 0.13% chance of it being a Digital Homicide game. And yet, Jim Sterling ended up covering all of them. Out of the literal thousands of games he could have covered and gotten just as much mileage out of, whenever Digital Homicide released a game, the game always went to the front of the line. And you have the gall to tell me that Sterling wasn't singling Digital Homicide out? Give me a fucking break. If he really did just stumble upon Digital Homicide games by sheer coincidence, the odds of him doing so 9 times in a row is astronomical. With those kinds of odds, Sterling shouldn't be on YouTube. He should be in fucking Vegas earning a damn fortune. But for the sake of argument, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that Sterling just happened to select some indie games at random to review, and lo and behold, despite 1,000,000,000 odds, Digital Homicide just happened to be the most common developer to release those games. In that case, how did he have screenshots of the forum posts Digital Homicide had made only a few hours after those posts were made? Yeah, why has nobody noticed that yet? Here's a screenshot that Jim Sterling took of Digital Homicide defending banning people. Notice here where it says that the post was made 7 hours ago as of the time that screenshot was taken. So I ask you, how the fuck did Sterling get that screenshot so quickly? I'll tell you why, because Sterling wasn't just covering Digital Homicide. The only way Sterling could possibly have gotten that screenshot so quickly after the post was made was if he was actively monitoring Digital Homicide's activities on Steam, like a goddamn vulture, looking for any excuse he could find to swoop in and give them yet another verbal thrashing. Sterling was giving priority to Digital Homicide, while simultaneously allowing far more treacherous shitheads to go unabated on Steam. I'm sorry, but I simply do not buy for a minute that what Digital Homicide actually wanted was for Sterling to just be quiet and let them go about peddling their shite. Because Jim Sterling was quite clearly doing far, far worse than that. What Sterling was doing was nothing short of stalking. And now it's time for the main event. The lawsuits against Jim Sterling and the 100 anonymous Steam users. Jim Sterling believes the lawsuit filed against him was frivolous, or spurious as he calls it. While I certainly do not doubt the sincerity of that opinion, I believe it is important that we get one thing straight at the outset of this discussion. The sole reason, and I mean literally the only reason, period, not just the only noteworthy reason or the only significant reason, why Jim Sterling considers the lawsuit to be frivolous can be seen on screen right now. Do you not see it? Okay, let me draw some arrows to help you understand. There, do you see it now? The mere fact that Jim Sterling is listed as the defendant in that case, alone, to the exclusion of all other factors, means that he considers that lawsuit to be frivolous. Let me put it this way. The two most serious allegations James Remine had supposedly made against Sterling are that Sterling had intentionally defamed the Remine brothers and tarnished their reputation accordingly, and that Sterling had intentionally conspired with Valve and the other ECC games in Europe to ruin the Remine brothers' career as game developers. Of course, Sterling publicly denies both of these things, or at the very least, in the case of the first count of defamation, denies doing them willfully and maliciously. However, let me make this perfectly clear. Even if both of those accusations against Sterling were completely true, and even if Jim Sterling knew full well that those accusations were completely true, he would still have, with 100% sincerity and honesty, considered the lawsuit against him to be completely frivolous, simply because of this right here. That being said, do I have any proof that the lawsuit was frivolous from an impartial standpoint? Well, at this point I am mostly reduced to speculation. I cannot find a free copy of the original lawsuit filed against Sterling in March of 2016, and the official records are gated behind a paywall. However, let's consider the fact that when they settled out of court, Jim Sterling admitted that James Remine was judgment-proof, aka that he didn't have any money to pay Sterling's legal fees even if a judge had ordered Remine to do so.
And we'd both suck up our legal fees, which I was going to have to do anyway, because let's face it, what does James have? He's a punchline with basic coding ability.
Now, bear in mind that this isn't just me speculating about Remine's financial situation. Jim Sterling admits to this himself. Now, because this fact, Remine's poverty, is established by the defendant's own admission, that means I do not have to prove it. It is already undisputed. So if anyone asks me to prove that Remine is impoverished, my proof is that Sterling admits to it. Keep this in mind because it will also come into play when I discuss the lawsuits filed against the Steam users. Now, if James Remine was so broke that he couldn't afford a lawyer or pay Sterling's legal fees even if he were ordered to, then I would imagine he filed this lawsuit against Sterling in forma pauperis. What does that mean? Well, that basically means that you plead poverty to the court, and the court allows you to file your lawsuit without paying a filing fee. Cool! Justice shouldn't be something that you have to be able to afford. But what does this have to do with a lawsuit being frivolous? Well, whenever a plaintiff files a lawsuit in forma pauperis, the judge in that case is supposed to review the lawsuit before it gets served on the defendant and throw the case out if he determines that it's frivolous. So, you ask me what impartial evidence I have that the lawsuit was not frivolous? Well, the mere fact that Digital Homicide's lawsuit actually got as far as being served on Jim Sterling in the first place necessarily means that a judge looked at that case and decided, yup, this lawsuit has some potential merit to it. Let's give this guy a day in court. Now, to be fair, that does not mean that Romine was going to win the lawsuit. It's one thing to accuse someone of violating your rights. It's quite another to actually prove those accusations in a court of law. It's called the burden of proof for a reason, because sometimes it is indeed quite the uphill battle. So that begs the question, what evidence, if any, did Romine have of the accusations he made against Sterling? Well, we do not, and probably never will, know for certain what evidence he has, due to the simple fact that this case was settled out of court and therefore will never see a trial. However, there is one thing that Jim Sterling mentioned in his video when Jim Sterling was sued for $10 million by Digital Homicide that makes me raise a single eyebrow.
When he's vocally challenged on this, a lot of these allegations so confidently written devolve into, I think Jim did this. Well, Jim might have done this. He might have spoken to Valve. He might have colluded with ECC Games. Maybes, mights, I thinks. What do you think I would do with that sort of argument?
Wait a minute. You questioned him about this? When exactly did you do that? When you say you questioned him, I assume you're talking about depositions. That's a type of discovery in the federal courts and most state courts as well. See, when you're conducting discovery in federal courts, there are two types of discovery that involve directly questioning witnesses and parties: depositions and interrogatories. With interrogatories, you write the questions down and either mail or email them to the opposing party. They then write down their answers and send them back to you through the same process. Depositions, meanwhile, involve the witness or party being summoned to an in-person interrogation. There's a court reporter present to create a transcript of every word that was said verbatim. Depositions sound like the most likely method by which James Romine was supposedly questioned about the allegations, because that is the type of discovery that involves Romine being put on the spot and having to answer the questions in person, whereas interrogatories would enable him to take his time, think about what he was going to say, and revise his answers many times over before the opposing party actually sees the answers. And since Romine was supposedly stumbling over his answers and gave them with much less confidence than in his written complaint, I assume that he was put on the spot when he was asked these questions, which means he was given a deposition. However, there is a gaping plot hole in Sterling's story. If the case was settled immediately after the case management conference, like Sterling claims, then there would not have been any discovery at all. No depositions, no interrogatories, no medical examinations, nada. What's really baffling about this plot hole is that Jim Sterling himself even calls attention to this little nuance of federal civil procedure in the video where he talks about the lawsuit. Here, have a listen.
At one point, Romain called our side asking if he could email interrogatories or would have to physically send them. Basically, Romain wanted to start asking me formal questions already. We had to explain to James that you do not send interrogatories at all at this stage. That's meant to happen after a case management conference, and we were nowhere near that level yet. To be fair, I didn't know a lot about these processes either, but that's why I had a lawyer.
So yeah, by Jim Sterling's own admission, the case should never have gotten to the point where Romain should have been questioned about these charges. So I would very much like to know, when exactly did you question Romain about the allegations? I can personally only think of one explanation. Sterling's claims about how Romain's testimony fell to pieces? That never happened. It was something that Sterling just completely pulled out of his ass just to make himself appear in the right. And since he didn't understand how federal civil procedure works, he probably didn't realize just how little sense it all made. So, with all that being said, I'd like you all to ask yourself this. What motive could Jim Sterling possibly have to make shit up about the weakness of Romain's testimony? Sounds to me like he knows he's guilty and is trying to cover his ass. Before we move on to the lawsuits against the anonymous Steam users, I have one last thing to say about the lawsuit against Jim Sterling. In their 2020 blog post, Digital Homicide explains that when they attended the case management conference and ultimately settled, James Romain was intimidated, not persuaded, into settling out of court because of all the things Sterling's lawyer threatened to do if the case was not settled. Chief among those threats were the threat to snoop around in James Romain's financial records and to snoop around in James Romain's medical records. Now, in his video, Digital Homicide resurfaces with some incredible BS. Jim Sterling defends these threats as reasonable discovery given the nature of the suit and the damages claimed.
He would have had to, since you all talked about money so much. He had to, you claimed severe emotional distress.
However, as I pointed out at the beginning of this video, I have been around this particular block once or twice before, and I am familiar with quite a few of the dirty tactics that unscrupulous lawyers tend to like to use whenever they think they can get away with it. Speaking from personal experience, the threats described raise some serious red flags for me. Would the defendants in this case have the right to inquire into James Romain's medical records? Sure, to an extent, seeing as how James Romain was claiming millions of dollars worth of psychological damage. It would indeed be Sterling's right to look at Romain's medical records to see if Romain really had suffered that kind of emotional trauma. However, I wonder if Sterling's lawyer might have exploited James Romain's lack of experience and understanding of the legal system in order to significantly overblow the scope of this intrusion into Romain's medical privacy. Bear in mind that Sterling did not attend this case management conference, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Digital Homicide has not responded to my request for interview. So we do not know exactly verbatim what was said, and as I've explained earlier in this video, sometimes the exact words spoken can make all the difference in the world. However, in my experience, it is not uncommon for lawyers to threaten inexperienced, especially pro se, litigants with threats to dig into their entire medical history. Every urine sample, every finger up the butt that they have ever been subjected to in their entire lives is fair game for lawyers to look at, and then put in the court record, at which point it becomes public record for all the world to see. His entire lifetime's worth of medical privacy would be pissed away in a day, all because he was claiming some medical thing as part of his lawsuit. Now, such a wide scope of James Remine's medical history would not be warranted. Involuntary intrusions into one's medical privacy are typically only allowed to the extent that they are reasonably related to the case at hand. In other words, when James Remine was claiming depression as an injury in this lawsuit, the defense in that case would have the right to take a look at the medical records where James Remine was diagnosed with depression, and that's about it. But, and this is the biggest but in the world, did James Remine know that? Did he know that he could simply place an objection to such overreaching discovery, and the judge would likely rule in his favor and not force him to submit to that discovery? Or did he actually believe that, if the case were to proceed, he would be forced to hand over his entire life's worth of medical records over to some jackass in a suit who, by said jackass's own admission, had the complete opposite of Remine's best interests at heart? Again, because we do not know what exactly was said by Sterling's lawyer, we cannot know for sure if he actually threatened such an overblown intrusion into James Remine's medical privacy. But I still feel it is something worth considering if any of you are going to take up my suggestion at the beginning of this video of giving Digital Homicide a second chance. Well, there is one last thing I need to talk about in this video. The lawsuit he filed against the 100 anonymous Steam users. Once again, I cannot see the original lawsuit that was filed because it is gated behind a paywall, so I do not know exactly what the allegations are. Jim Sterling often likes to couch it as saying that Digital Homicide sued the Steam users for saying mean things about them on the internet. However, based on the news articles I have read, the lawsuit was for harassment, stalking, and impersonation. To that end, I defer you to my earlier arguments about how none of us deserve that kind of verbal abuse that Sterling himself, let alone these anonymous Steam users, leveled at Digital Homicide. So unless I could see the exact comments verbatim left by these Steam users, I'm inclined to give Digital Homicide the benefit of the doubt. After all, when I discussed the kind of verbal abuse that none of us deserve, I even shared with you just a handful of extremely vulgar comments that people left on my videos and Reddit posts. Admit it, the vast majority of you felt I was absolutely justified in blocking those people, weren't you? So, as you can see from that example, I am willing to give Digital Homicide the benefit of the doubt, seeing as I can no longer see the exact comments that were posted against him. However, based on the secondhand research I was able to cobble together, the 100 anonymous Steam users listed as defendants in this lawsuit were not chosen at complete random. Rather, they were chosen because they were all part of a Steam group called Digital Homicide Poop Games, a Steam group dedicated to review bombing Digital Homicide's games, leveling cuss-filled attacks at Digital Homicide, and making sure as many people as possible understood just how shitty Digital Homicide's games were. Among the most atrocious things this Steam group purportedly had done include, but are not limited to, sending a box of literal feces to them in the mail, calling James Remine's wife a whore, and donating some bits of money to his GoFundMe account before immediately retracting those donations, leaving Digital Homicide with the burden of paying the merchant's fees, but without any incoming money to show for it. Okay, so let me get this straight. James Remine sued these guys for harassment and stalking, because they had literally colluded with each other. Literally colluded with each other to form a Steam group dedicated to harassing and stalking him. And that lawsuit was somehow frivolous? How? How is that lawsuit frivolous? What, do you actually believe what I alluded to earlier on this video, that game developers need to take not just criticism, but completely vulgar abuse, like they're in the goddamn army? Or do you not even care if the lawsuit was frivolous or not, but literally anytime Digital Homicide does anything in any way, shape, or form, you're automatically going to assume it's frivolous no matter what? Before we wrap up, there is one aspect of this lawsuit that I want to talk about: the impersonation. Now, as a matter of law, impersonation is when you pretend to be someone else, either to leech off their reputation, e.g. to get a loan on their credit, or to maliciously sabotage that person's reputation. Because I cannot see the lawsuit in question, I do not know exactly what the allegations are that pertain to impersonation. However, there is one thing I was able to see, since Jim Sterling had kept the screenshots for this and used them in his videos, that seems an awful lot like impersonation. The 43 games Digital Homicide purportedly uploaded to Steam Greenlight before Valve restricted their right to upload games to Steam. What makes me think it was an act of impersonation, you ask? Well, I do not know everything about how Steam Greenlight works, and since Steam Greenlight has been replaced with Steam Direct, I cannot reliably research it. However, one thing I do know about Steam Greenlight is that every game submission, even those games that didn't get enough votes to get on Steam proper, came with a non-refundable $100 filing fee. This means that for Digital Homicide to upload these 43 different games onto Steam Greenlight all at once, it would have cost the Remind brothers more than $4,000. Do you know what the Reminds could have done if they had $4,000 just burning a hole in their pocket? Why were they representing themselves against Jim Sterling if that was the case? For $4,000, you can get, well, not a great lawyer, but at least a decent one. Why was he attempting to raise money for a lawyer through PayPal or GoFundMe if he already had $4,000 to spare? Okay, you're probably thinking right now, maybe the Remind brothers weren't actually as broke as they claimed to be. Except, no, you can't really argue that, because as I mentioned earlier, Jim Sterling himself freely admitted that they were judgment-proof. If they had $4,000 to burn, Sterling would almost certainly have demanded that they reimburse him for at least a portion of his legal fees. So no, I can only think of one explanation as to how this could possibly have happened, while still keeping the Reminds judgment-proof. Somebody must have stolen Digital Homicide's login and password and uploaded all of these games on Digital Homicide's behalf, specifically with the intention of getting Valve to restrict their upload privileges, or at the very least in an attempt to enhance the public perception that Digital Homicide were shovelware developers of the highest order. At that point, well, that's called impersonation. And the Remind brothers absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, had the right to seek redress through the court system. The lawsuit was not frivolous. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I have given you all something to think about. Digital Homicide may have gone overboard with their Review the Reviewer video, but Jim Sterling still threw the first punch. However, after that one single solitary overreaction on Digital Homicide's part, literally everyone else are the ones who just couldn't let it go, the Remines might have screwed up once, but they did not deserve even 1% of the harassment they got. Packages of feces, death threats, monetary sabotage by exploiting GoFundMe's terms and conditions. Hell, even if they really did spam Steam with low-effort asset flip garbage, they still did not deserve anywhere near that level of abuse. And then, when Digital Homicide attempted to seek justice through the court system, Valve decided that this was Digital Homicide crossing the line. Never mind the fact that the people harassing him had already pole vaulted over the line many times over. No, Digital Homicide was the one who was being hostile towards Steam users, not the other way around. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe you all owe Digital Homicide an apology. I certainly don't owe them an apology because I never harassed them like that. But I definitely believe Valve should reinstate Digital Homicide's account, and this time actively police the harassment that customers have leveled against them. It's one thing to leave a negative review. It's quite another to send death threats, attack the person's family, issue repeated cuss-filled harassment, and issue chargebacks for the sole purpose of costing them merchants' fees. At the very least, maybe we should convince Nintendo to give them a chance on the Nintendo eShop, seeing as they seem to be just as welcoming to newbies as Steam or even the Google App Store. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Acer Thorn out. Peace!